Hey there guys, and welcome to the second video in this series where we're going to be building a higher and lower guessing game in Python 3. So just to overlay the idea for this video, we're going to be starting off by looking at our main function, and I know we covered this in the previous video, but I'll recap the functions that we're going to be doing today. The job of the main function is effectively a driver function. So if I flick into VS Code for a second, this is main. Main takes a single input, which is file name, which it uses later on. And its job is fairly straightforward. It doesn't do a whole lot of the game's logic, but what it does, it basically controls when the other functions in the code are going to be called. So you can see it starts off by grabbing the player's name. We then do the lower upper numbers. We use those two lower upper numbers to then get the random number, do the main gameplay, so on and so forth, and then finally we save the data from the game to file. So that's the job of main, and we're going to be starting on this one today here. We're also going to be looking at these two functions in this sort of greenish colour, and the job of these two functions is to effectively control the difficulty of the game. So the first one is going to ask the user to input a low and a high number, so say if they did 1 and 10 for example. We then pass the low and high number to this function, where this uses the random module to make a random number between that lower and upper bound. So these two effectively control the game's difficulty. So if you did say 1 and 1,000, this will give you a fairly difficult random number to pick, or you could do 1 and 10. So we'll jump straight into Python and we'll get going. So the first thing we want to do is start off by building our main function here. And the way we're going to do this is really slowly, really simply. We're going to stop at each key point just to explain what's happening. So I have a blank file here called main, and we'll get the ball rolling straight away. So we're going to do def. Let's make this a bit bigger for you. So whenever we use the def keyword, we're telling Python that we're about to define a new function. We're going to define a new function called main here. And what we then pass into this section is what's called a parameter. So we're basically saying this function called main takes in something, and we're going to refer to that in the function as file name. We can also pass in a hint. So if you do a colon here and say str, we're saying to Python, this file name, which you're going to be expecting, this should be a string. This isn't actually strictly enforced. It comes up as what's called a type hint, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. And this function is going to give us nothing back. So to do that, we can do an arrow and say none. It's just telling the user that this function gives nothing back. And that's fairly straightforward because it's going to take in this file name, it's going to do all of its logic, such as calling the other functions, and at the end, if we don't want it to give back anything, its job is to simply to drive the rest of the program. Let's do a simple documentation string here. So let's write driver function. I won't do mine exactly as the same as the finished example, just obviously for time. So let's just do this nice and simple. We'll say driver function to call other functions. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to write pass for the time being. What we're going to do is just do a mock call of this function. So let's define a file name down here, and let's just say scores.txt, and then we're going to go ahead and say call this main function, passing in file name as the argument. So let's hit run. Okay, looks good. Nothing particularly exciting because we're calling a function that isn't doing anything, but that's okay, we can deal with that. What we could do is actually just go ahead and print file name here just to check. And there we go, pretty good. I want to quickly demonstrate what these type hints do here. So if I rewind this back a second and do main, there we go. So this str here, it's a hint because it's basically hinting to the user what should file name be. And just to show you something, if I did this as 1, 2, 3, it doesn't really do anything. The type hints aren't strictly enforced by Python. They're merely just there to be hints, and that's all they are. So I'll bring that back for a second. And just leave that there like this. And let's remove print file name. So if I can flick back here just for a second. Now the first thing main does, it's going to ask the user for their name. And the reason why is because when we come to the end of the game, we're going to save the user's name along with their guesses and how well they did. So we'll ask for their name first, and then we're going to be using that name later on. And to do so, we're going to be using what's called the input function here. So let's do a quick comment, just to write what we're doing. I'll make sure I could do it as best English as I can. Get the player's name. Okay, so to do so, let's define a variable called name, and then we're going to use input, open some parentheses here, and now you can just do input like that, and that's fine, but it's much better to give the user some kind of prompt. So basically whatever I put in here as a string is what's going to be displayed in the console down here. So I'm going to say, please enter your name. Yes, make sure you leave a space here as well, and we're good to go. Now, of course, it's always pretty dangerous whenever you come to user input, because they could enter whatever they want to, or they could enter nothing at all. And of course, if they entered nothing, we're going to have a blank string, which won't look great later on. And of course, a blank string, that will evaluate to a Boolean false. So what we can do is we can say if not name. So effectively saying if nothing has been entered. So if this come up on the screen and the user just hit the enter key, that would be an empty string, which would come back as the Boolean false. So this is basically saying if the name equates to false, then do X, Y, Z. So we're just going to say a quick print statement. We'll say no name entered. To keep it simple, just do return. Of course, this could be beefed up and put into its own function. We'll keep it nice and simple for the time being, however. So let's hit run, and there's our prompt. I'm going to just hit enter. There we go. So because I hit enter here, there was no string entered. So of course this statement became true because there is no name, it's blank. Therefore we saw the print, this returned, then we ended, and that's fine. Okay, so what we'll do is try that again. And let's just try James. Oh, probably not there, that would help. Try James down here, and there we go. So this time we didn't get no name entered, the program has ended successfully, and there's no errors. Right then, the next thing to do, if I can flick back to our slides for a second, we've done this bit, so we've asked the user for their name, so that's going to come back later on in steps 5 and 6. What we want to do now is use the same idea of user input, but we want to use user input to ask for these low and high numbers, and that function is going to then return those low and high numbers here. So there's no harm in doing this. We could actually go ahead and do low, high, but now before we've even defined the function, we could do this, and it's completely fine. So if I say retrieve lower, upper numbers, okay, now all I need to do is steal this and define a function called that, basically. So if I do def this here, and then what this is going to do is actually return a tuple. So if I do this tuple and just do some dots there for a second, okay, and now this returns a tuple because it's going to return the low and high numbers. And whenever you do something like this, low, high equals, this function, because this function is going to be returning a tuple of two things, those two things get unpacked. The first item in the tuple goes to low, and the second item in the tuple goes to high, and then we're good to go. So let's start on our retrieve lower upper numbers. And arguably, this is, I would argue, to be the most complex function. Just because we're using user input twice, we have to catch possible errors in this here. And we've also got some basic logic to check that the lowest number is actually the lowest and not the other way around. Of course, that would cause issues later on. So let's do a quick documentation string. Let's say, of course, this could be more imaginative than I am. There we go. So I'll just keep it at that for now. Of course, I think in my example I've made this a fair bit bigger, but yeah, that's fine. So we've got our documentation string, and what we're going to do is fairly complex. So I'm going to make some space down here and start to build up our logic. So what we're going to do is effectively give the user a set number of chances to enter this correctly. So let's suppose they ask for the low number and the high number, but they enter it in the form of, say, I don't know, 1 minus 1. That's going to break the process later on. So you want to make sure they enter the lowest as actually the lowest and the highest as actually the highest. Make sure they enter things that aren't going to break. So say, for example, if you entered TEN rather than 10, that's going to break as well. So we're going to do a bit of try and accept to try and catch this happening, and just make it so that it's pretty foolproof. Of course, using user input isn't completely foolproof. There's always going to be some way you could trick it or break the system, but I think this is fairly foolproof. So what we'll do is I'm going to start off by saying, let's do a variable to define how many attempts they're allowed to do. So we'll do attempts to enter, let's say, valid nums. I'm going to give them 3. Of course, you could be harsher or more lenient. I'm going to say you've got 3 attempts, and once that happens, you're out, and I'll give the numbers for you. And then we want to keep track of the number of attempts they've actually had. So let's just do current attempts here. And let's put this as 0 for the time being. Right. Now, the next thing is going to be a while loop. And if you're not familiar with while loops, effectively we're saying, whilst some condition is true, do something. So for our while loop, we're going to say, whilst the number of attempts they're on is less than this, you can go ahead and keep asking them. So at the moment they've had no attempts, so no problem at all. Keep asking. So keep trying to put in a low and a high number. However, say they have 3 attempts, suddenly they're not less than this. They've had too many attempts, therefore the loop cannot run, and we're going to exit. So we're going to build this logic into our loop now. So we're going to say, while the number of attempts they're on is less than or equal to the... There we go, where is it? That one, thank God for autocorrect. There we are. So while the number of attempts they're on is less than the maximum allowable, then cool, we can keep going. And the first thing we'll do is increment this here. So we'll do current attempts plus equals 1. So for every time we enter into this loop, we're going to say, okay, you're on attempt 1. Okay, maybe they get it wrong and we come back around again. Now you're on attempt 2. Now you're on attempt 3. And suddenly, say this goes to 4, this is not going to run now because they've gone over this attempt, max attempts to enter these valid nums. So the first thing we'll do is get this incremented here. And now what we're going to do here is ask for a low and then a high. And then we're going to put those inside a try and except here. So I'm going to start off by saying low is equal to input. And let's just do enter lowest like this here. And then what we can then do is really important next. So by default, input takes in a string, and we don't want that. So we're going to say int here. There we go, just like that. And then we can copy this and do the same again, just for our high. So let's do int input, enter lowest, and enter, let's keep it lowercase, enter highest, just like that here. And there we go. And because there's going to be a fair amount of logic in here, I want to kind of do the returns as we go, and then gradually make it more complex. So let's just see, say if I just did return low and high like this here. Let's just give that a go and see what happens. And then down here, bear in mind, say we entered 1 and 5 here, that means this function returns a tuple containing 1 and 5, so therefore 1 and 5 go here and here. So if we just go and do print low and high, and up here, let's call this, so enter our name as James, that's fine, and here we go, we're in the loop. So this situation, so this bit here came out as true, our current attempts, they are less than or equal to 3. That gets incremented by 1. Now we ask for the lowest. So let's just do 1, 5. Cool, no problem at all. In a perfect world, that would be great. The user would enter this right every single time. But straight away, I keep doing that, don't I? Let's do that as James in here. If I do 1 like this, there we go. There's our first possible error. Someone could enter this incorrectly, or they could enter nothing at all. If you were to go ahead and say, do Alex, and then nothing, Python said to you here, effectively, I don't know how to convert this to an integer. So the good rule for that, if I take this, value error, and again here, value error, we're going to basically say, try and do this, but if a value error appears whilst doing so, move on. Okay? So what we can do is do try. And if you're not familiar with try and except, basically what it does, we have this try section here, which basically says, try and do this code. And this bit is basically like saying, however, if trying to run that code, you stumble across this, in this case a value error, then rather than crashing, do something instead. And that do something instead can just be, or it can be whatever you want really. In this case, we're going to say, enter them properly. Or maybe do something more imaginative than what I've just done. And then continue as well. So if you've not seen continue before, this will basically say, right, if you raise an error whilst doing any of these two here, then rather than crashing and doing this and stopping the program, print this to the screen here, and then go back to the top of the loop. So rather than coming down to here, like line 19, whatever, it's going to go back to the top, reevaluate this, and keep going. So let's try something else instead. Let's hit run. Let's try James. We'll do 1 as lowest, 10 as highest. Yep, no problem at all, that works. Then we'll try and do 1 like this. Check that out. So rather than crashing, we caught a value error, which is what happens when we try to pass an invalid input to the in function, in this case one for 1. And rather than crashing, we said, okay, that value error, you just raised it, so let's do this and then continue back to the top of the loop instead, and we're good to go. So the other way which you could flip this round is more like a logical error. So if I kill the program here for a second, let's enter the name, do a short name, and let's say we did let's do 10 as the lowest and maybe 1 as the highest. So that's valid. That didn't make this crash. We entered correct numbers, but they're the wrong way around. So what we want to try and do is a bit of logic to try and catch that. So what we can do instead is do an else here, and the else will kick in if the except doesn't. So in this case, if we do low and high, no error is raised. Cool. That means we don't have to do the except. Therefore, we jump down to the else. So that means we can we can look at low and high properly now because they've been input as integers. Therefore, we have low and high as 2 integers ready to be looked at and checked just to make sure that low is actually less than high, which would be good. So we can just say if low is less than high, just return them, just like that. However, so say for example, say we did 1 for low, 10 for high. If 1 is less than 10, perfect. Return them. We'll be using them down here. But if not, we'll just say continue because they've entered the low and high incorrectly. So we can just say, right, you didn't enter the low and high correctly. Let's just do correct order, and of course we'll do continue because we want them to enter low, actually lower. So let's do some testing. Keep the testing fairly simple and just to not overrun. Let's do the lowest as 5 and the highest as 1. Okay, no problem at all. Now let's try and make it crash like this. Right, enter them properly, no problem at all. Let's say I get them. There we go. Perfect. So I know it's some pretty simple validation, but that's a really nice way just to make sure that first of all they enter actual numbers, and if they don't, we catch that here and make them try again. However, if they enter actual numbers but in the wrong way around, then we tell them and we ask them to try again. All we need now is the else for this here. So basically, if they have too many attempts, maybe we could do some kind of message to say, sorry, you've gone over the top. So, we'll return something for you. So to do so, you're going to look at your while, come down here and do an else. The else will basically happen when this is no longer true. So when this is true, we can go off and try and enter the numbers, validate those numbers and return. However, when this is no longer true, the else is now going to kick in. Let's just do, so we'll say too many tries, and then we'll treat them as babies and say, okay, you can just have 1 and 10 here. Get rid of this and make it a bit smaller, just so we can see it all together. Bring all this back up. I generally try and keep 2 spaces between functions. There we go. 2 is fine like that. So let's do some testing. I want to make it go over the number of attempts to see what happens. So let's do Ian. Let's do 1. Let's do that. There we go. Cool. So after that, it said too many tries, and we just got back 110, which is fine. I want to just double check it works correctly. So if I try Ian again, let's do lowest as 5, and let's do the highest as 15. And there we go. We have 5 and 15 there. So we'll do a quick run through just through this function one more time, and then we'll move on to our next function, which is trying to retrieve our random numbers. So from the top, we first set up 2 variables. We enter a maximum number of attempts allowed, in this case 3, and we set up a variable called current attempts to log how many tries they're going to have. We then jump into a while loop which says whilst the number of attempts our user is on is less than the max allowable, so 3, record that they've had an additional attempt by incrementing this by 1, and then try and get 2 inputs, so the lowest and the highest. We use try and accept because they could enter something here that's not a correct integer, such as one for 1, and that would raise a value error. So we use try and accept to account for that. If they do make that error happen, we tell them enter them properly, and we use continue to go back to the top of the loop. The else is here to basically say, right, if there was no error, just check that the low and high are the right way round, and if they are, return them. However, if they're not the right way round, tell them so, and kick them back to the top of the loop. And finally, we have the else, and this happens for when situations say like, maybe this now goes to 4, so that so 4 is no longer less than the max allowable, because the max allowable is 3, so therefore print they've had too many tries, and we're going to treat them like babies and return 1 and 10. So that's our function completely done. If I can flick back here for a second, we're now going to use those lower upper numbers to now establish the random number here using the random module. So if you're not familiar with the random module, it comes as a built-in to Python. If it's built in, it basically means you don't have to use pip install to download it. It's already there, which is pretty good. So we hop back in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is head right to the top. Imports always go at the top, and we're going to say import random. Now this can be done in quite a few different ways. We're just going to be using one tool from random. So we could technically say from random import that tool, but I'm just going to do import random to keep it nice and simple. And what we're going to be doing is basically using a tool called randint. What we're going to do is actually show it down here for a sec. I blank out this function call, and what I'm going to do is just say value is equal to random.randint 1 and 10. So that's the syntax we take here. So we say from the random module, go to the randint function, and of course randint will give you a random number between 2 points. If we say 1 and 10, it's going to give us a random number between 1 and 10. We get 5 that time, we get 1 this time. So rather than using 1 and 10, we have 2 points here, low and high. And low and high were basically what were generated in our previous function. So we're going to make a new function which takes in low and high, does this, so it basically passes in low and high is here and here, and just spits that number out the other side, just to make it nice and clear and just keep everything in its own function so it becomes nice and modular. And that function I'm going to put right at the top, so let's do a new function called def. We'll call it def establish random number. Now it might seem kind of trivial just doing a whole function just for this, but it's a really nice way of coding. If you can have everything in its own function, its own kind of modular container, so to speak, it just makes your code look a lot nicer as well. It's a lot easier to maintain having everything in its own set place where everything lives. So this number, this establish random number function is going to take 2 inputs. So just like this here, it's value equals random.randint low point high point. We're going to do exactly the same thing in our function, except that we're going to pass those numbers into the function first, then pass them to the random function and get it to return that number here. So what we can say, let's say this function takes lowest, and I want that to be an integer. And then when I'm going to ask it to take in highest, which is also going to be an integer as well, and this function is going to be returning an integer. And all I'm going to do is say return random.randint, and then basically take lowest and highest from here. So lowest and highest here. Little trick as well. Of course, we're just using this once. It doesn't matter hugely. But if you're using a lot of calls to a module such as random, you could say import random as an alias. So in this case, as RA. That then means you can do this inside. It's like saying, I'm James, but you can call me Jay, right? It's a way to shorten something, especially if you're using it all the time. In this case, not so much, but just thought I'd show you it. And of course, let's do our docstring. And let's say return random number between lowest and, let's do a little dash like that there, between lowest and highest. So all I want to do now is just test that this works. So I'm going to come back down to main, and all we're going to do is basically take these numbers here, so 41 and 42, these 2 lines here, we're currently looking at the lower upper numbers. So first of all, we're calling it and then printing it. What we're going to do is just sort of switch this around and then use these 2 values here. So what I'm going to do first, I will do a little print statement to say, let's see. Yeah, first of all, we'll do an F string to print off what they've done. So we'll do low number, let's see. Low number is blank, and of course feel free to use better English than I am right now. This was a real program that I was doing for work. It'd be a bit different, but purely for the video, I'll keep it nice and simple. So the idea of an F string, if you've not seen one before, basically it's a string and you have spaces in that string where data can go. So it's like saying, low number is blank and high number is, is blank. And then I can just pass in low and high here like this. So just a way to kind of, with this being a game, be good to kind of show some feedback to the to the user as it's going. And then we'll do random number. And now it's time to call the establish random number function, and then simply pass in low and high. And then once that's done, let's just print that it's been done. So we can say, I'll do random number established. Let's see. Starting. There we go, like that. What you might choose to do as well, do a -n after each of these here. That'll just make sure that we can, make it look a bit more presentable. Okay, let's give that a run. Just double check it all works. And make sure we actually call a function. So we'll call main here. We'll uncomment file name, and we'll get the ball rolling. So please enter your name. Let's try James. 1, 10, and there we go. So low number is 1 and high number is 10. Random number established, starting. Now, this would be really silly. Obviously, don't do this in the proper game, but we just want to have a look. That's just actually what I'll do. I'll print it here for now, just to check this out. Obviously, you wouldn't do this because you'd immediately give the answer away, but just to show kind of what's going on. So I did lowest as 1 and highest as 10,000. There we go. Our random number is 1783. So to show you where that would fit into the picture, in the next video, we're going to be looking at our main gameplay function. And this is basically a big while loop, which takes in that random number and then gets you to try and guess it. So just to recap what we've got to, we've started main. We have our lower upper numbers function done. We have our established random number function good to go. So this number is now ready to begin the game. In the next video, we're going to be looking at how to build the game and also how to do the 2 functions at the end to say, okay, the game is done. Let's take all that data and save it to file. And before we finish, I'll do a quick sweep through one more time, just really going over the logic of what we've done here. So to do a bit of housekeeping, I'll make sure I've got my data right out here. I'm also going to add some comments here. Let's get the upper and lower numbers. This is purely for preference. If it's the first time doing a piece of code or a new game or a piece of software, I like to do these just initially to kind of get my bearings together, and once it's done and you're happy, you can always feel free to remove those comments here. But in this case, I think it's quite useful to do. So you can see this follows a really clear pattern now. We're getting the player's name first of all, using input. We're then setting the upper and lower numbers here. And of course, that's done so by calling this function, which goes in here. It does the logic we discussed earlier, and it returns a tuple of those 2 numbers. So because it returns a tuple of those 2 numbers, those are unpacked and given to low and high respectively. We print off to the user what those low and high numbers were, and then what we do is then take those low and high numbers, pass them to this function, which is set up here. This function uses the random module and uses the randint function to say, give me a random number between lowest and highest. That's then returned and given to this variable here. So now we're ready in the next section to actually plug this random number into the main gameplay loop, and it's good to go. Cheers for that, guys. I'll see you in the next video, and have a great rest of your week.